So, respected venerable, respected venerables, friends, welcome to the University of the West. And on behalf of the Buddha West Club, we'd like to welcome everybody here to the Dharma talk. And we are very fortunate to have a senior monk in the Thai forest tradition here. This is Ajaan Geoff, and he's the abbot of Wat Metta Monastery down in Escondido. And there's currently about 10 monks training with him down there. And Ajaan Geoff graduated from Oberlin College in 1971, and then he went to Thailand and studied under Ajaan, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Ajaan Jotiko, who was a student of Ajaan Lee. And Ajaan Geoff ordained in 1976, and he trained with his teacher until his teacher passed in 1986. And in 1991, he traveled to San Diego, San Diego County, where he helped set up Wat Metta. And so I used to be a monk with Thich Nhat Hanh, and I remember using Ajaan's books on the monastic precepts. So his translation of monastic precepts is used widely in the monastic communities. So I feel like that was my first encounter with Ajaan Geoff. So in addition to being monastic for a very long time, he's has a regular meditation practice, so he's a solid practitioner, and then also a very prolific scholar. So he's translated a lot of the Pali into English. So if you go to the Access to Insight website, a lot of the Pali suttas are translated by Ajaan Geoff. And in our class, I took a philosophy class with Dr. Chu this last semester, and so we learned a lot about early Buddhism. And so a lot of the teachings or the translations or the commentaries were from Ajaan Geoff, so we learned a lot about early Buddhism and kind of distinguishing characteristics of that. So a lot of his scholarship has been to kind of rediscover what early Buddhism is. So we're very, very grateful, very happy that Ajaan has come here to teach today.
This evening I'd like to talk about mindfulness and concentration. These are two important factors of the path. Right mindfulness, right concentration come at the end of the path as part of its culmination. And in the modern interpretation, we're told that they're radically different things. Mindfulness is a broad, accepting awareness, sometimes called bare attention, that it accepts all experiences without trying to change anything. Whereas concentration is very much involved in an effort to get the mind focused and be exclusionary. One writer has actually stated that the Buddha taught two different paths, because if mindfulness is broad and accepting and concentration is narrow and exclusionary, you can't do them at the same time. And so one path is a sevenfold path, which includes right effort and right concentration, but not mindfulness. And the other is a sixfold path that has right mindfulness, but no effort, no concentration. He said this seriously. But when you look at the Pali Canon, though, you don't see the Buddha talking about these practices in these ways. I mean, he actually talks about them as practices that go together, work together. To begin with, until you hit awakening, there is no such thing as bare attention. So if you look at Dependent Core Arising, the Buddha's analysis of how the mind creates suffering for itself, you find that attention is something that is fabricated, i.e. there are intentional ideas, intentional motives that go into how you pay attention to things. Your mind is more active than passive. And in normal people, that fabrication or that intentional element is done in ignorance. When you're practicing the path, you're still fabricating something, but you're fabricating it with knowledge, i.e. in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Seeing where there's stress, what the cause of stress is, what the cessation of stress might be, and the path to that cessation. And in seeing those four things, it's not just seeing them, but also realizing there are duties that you have to do with regard to each. So you don't just accept things. If you see stress, you try to comprehend it. If you see the cause, you try to let go of it. You try to realize the cessation of stress by developing the path. So there's an agenda in the path, and that means the right mindfulness as part of the path has to have an agenda. And then when the Buddha goes on, when he defines mindfulness, he doesn't define it as bare attention. He defines it as actually a factor of your memory. What is the faculty of mindfulness? There's a case for a monk, a disciple of the noble ones. He's mindful, highly meticulous, remembering and able to call to mind even things that was done and said long ago. That's a function of memory. Then that memory is applied to what you're doing in the present moment in this way. You remain focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. Or you remain focused on feelings in and of themselves, the mind in and of itself, or mental qualities in and of themselves, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. In other words, you make up your mind you're going to stay with the body, and then you remember that as you focus on each breath coming in, each breath going out, or whatever way you are going to stay focused on the body. Or if you're going to be focusing on the quality of feelings that come, say, from being with the breath, you would remember that. You have to keep reminding yourself to stay with these things. The reminding there is the faculty of mindfulness. It goes together with two other faculties you may notice. There's alertness, which means watching what's happening, seeing what's happening, seeing what it's causing. And then there's the factor of ardency, which is when you're trying to do it skillfully. Remember, there are duties that the Buddha gives you with regard to the Four Noble Truths, as I just said, is to comprehend the stress, like abandon the cause, realize the cessation of stress, and develop the path. Or you can look at simply the duties to abandon unskillful qualities and to develop skillful qualities in the mind. That's the ardency part of the formula here. So in the ability to keep things in mind is used as part of the path. It has an agenda. And it's not always open and accepting. Here's one case where the Buddha talks about mindfulness that happens in a very directed, willful sort of way. Just as when a person whose turban or head was on fire would put forth extra desire, effort, diligence, endeavor, earnestness, mindfulness, and alertness to put out the fire on his turban or head. In the same way, if you should put forth extra desire, effort, diligence, endeavor, relentlessness, mindfulness, and alertness for the abandoning of any unskillful qualities that arise in the mind. In other words, if your head is on fire, you don't just sit there and say, well, aren't these flames beautiful? Or accept the flames. You put them out. And you do that mindfully, i.e. you do it remembering that this is really important. You've got to focus right here. The Buddha says this many times. One of his definitions of right mindfulness is that you remember to abandon wrong view and you to remain in right view. Remember to abandon wrong resolve and to remain in right resolve, and all the way down to the practice of the path. There's another passage here where he talks about how mindfulness functions, not just watching things arising and passing away, but if there's something good that hasn't arisen yet, you try to give rise to it. Once it has arisen, you try to protect it. Here's the passage. And how is mindfulness a governing principle? The mindfulness that I will make complete any training with regard to good conduct that is not yet complete, or I will protect with discernment any training with regard to good conduct that is complete, is well established right within. In other words, if you have any further training to do, you are mindful to do it. Give rise to that training. Once that quality has been secured in the mind, then you are mindful to protect it. You don't let it pass away. Similarly, here, the mindfulness that I will make complete any training with regard to the basics of the holy life that is not yet complete, or protect with discernment any training with regard to the basics of the holy life that is complete, is well established right within. Another example, the mindfulness that I will scrutinize with discernment any Dharma that is not yet scrutinized, or I will protect with discernment any Dharma that has been scrutinized, is well established right within. So the function of mindfulness here is to give rise to skillful things, and when skillful things are there is to maintain them. So it's not just letting things arise and pass away. Certain things you want to arise and then you protect them. This is one of the functions of mindfulness. And in this way, you can see that the mindfulness is an important part of concentration practice. If you're going to stay focused on one thing, you have to keep remembering to stay right there. And the Buddha talks about the interaction between mindfulness and concentration in many ways. To begin with, he says that the establishings of mindfulness, which I just described to you, maintaining focus on the body, feelings, mind, mental qualities in and of themselves, ardent, alert, mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. That's the theme of right concentration. Same with feelings. And, there's also a passage here where he describes this practice in a way that shows that it leads right into the jhanas, which are strong stages of right concentration, which actually are a necessary part of the path. Having abandoned the 5 hindrances, you remain focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world, similar with the other 3. Just as if an elephant trainer were to plant a large post in the ground and were to bind a forest elephant to it by the neck. Now this doesn't sound like open and accepting awareness. You're trying to train that element, and you're treating it pretty harshly. You're trying to bind a forest elephant by the neck in order to break it of its forest habits, its forest memories and resolves, its distraction, fatigue, and fever over leaving the forest, to make it delight in the town and to inculcate in it habits congenial to human beings. In the same way, these 4 establishings of mindfulness are bindings for the awareness of the disciple, the noble ones, to break you of your household habits, your household memories and resolves, your distraction, fever, and fatigue over leaving the household life, for the attainment of the right method and the realization of unbinding. Okay, the mindfulness is there to keep you with your concentration object. Okay, once you're settled in with the object, then the Buddha teaches you further. It says, come now, remain focused on the body in and of itself, but do not think any thoughts connected with the body. We'll be getting into the stages of right concentration a little bit later in the talk, but when you move from the first, what they call jhana, or level of absorption, to the second, you basically drop all your thinking and you're just focused on the sensation of the object. So here he's saying, remain focused on feelings in and of themselves, but do not think any thoughts connected with feelings. Remain focused on the mind in and of itself, but do not think any thoughts connected with the mind. Or remain focused on mental qualities in and of themselves, but do not think any thoughts connected with mental qualities. Thus, with the stilling of these thoughts and of any thoughts of evaluation, you enter the second jhana. So the first jhana is when you're actually getting the mind to stay focused on your frame of reference or your establishing of mindfulness. Once you've got it there, you drop any thinking around the topic and you get into the second jhana. So in this way, mindfulness practice melds right into concentration practice. Okay. So the modern understandings of mindfulness and concentration are at odds with what the Buddha taught about mindfulness and concentration. And this is an important issue for anyone who's seeking to follow the Buddha's path. Can you do one without the other, or do you really need to combine the both? How do you understand these factors of the path so that you can put them together? And it says at present this issue has even wider implications because the common understanding of mindfulness has become the basis of an industry. We now have the mindfulness industry. People go out and they train people in mindfulness, and they train them in all kinds of situations, having nothing to do with the Buddhist path at all. If you go online and you look under benefits of mindfulness meditation, and I think it's number 3 or 4 when you Google this, there's something called Life Sciences, and Life Sciences will tell you the 5 benefits of mindfulness meditation, including 1 is it improves your sex life. And 3, if you're a soldier, it makes you a better soldier, a more efficient killing machine. Now, I cannot think that the Buddha would have approved of either of those applications. But what happens, as we're getting this, mindfulness is getting more spread out to the society, there are a lot of claims being made for it. And these claims are coming under scrutiny. I just recently saw an article in which someone was saying all these research projects that have been done on mindfulness that were showing all the benefits of mindfulness really have not proven anything at all. They were poorly designed. The concept of mindfulness is too vague to really have any scientific validity. There was even a case recently where, as you know, the National Institutes of Health have been funding mindfulness meditation research projects. and people were getting a lot of research grants on this. And then NIH did what's called a meta-analysis, where they went back and they looked at the results of these things. And again, they said the results, that this research is all, to use the term of art, crap. The concept is too vague, and the research was very poorly designed. A lot of the people who were doing these research things went to a Buddhist teacher I know and asked if he could provide them with a definition of mindfulness that would pass muster with the NIH. Which is kind of sad. You think mindfulness is being defined for the purposes of a government bureau rather than for the purposes of Buddhist practice. So as these issues get more and more under scrutiny, it reflects poorly on the Buddhist path. If mindfulness was supposed to be so useful and yet it's not as useful as they thought it was, people would say, okay, this is proof that the Buddhist path is not as effective as it could be. So a lot of people will end up missing the opportunity to gain benefit from the way the Buddha actually himself taught mindfulness and concentration together. The question is, where did these misunderstandings about mindfulness come from? There are two basic sources. One is a misreading of the Satipatthana Sutta. Now, the Satipatthana Sutta is a fairly long sutta that you find in the Pali Canon. It's the longest sutta on the topic of mindfulness practice, and many times it's believed to be the Buddha's comprehensive treatment of what mindfulness means. But when you actually look at the sutta, you begin to realize that there are certain things that tell you this is not comprehensive. One, the Buddha himself once said that if he wanted to teach mindfulness, he could do it for 100 years, and he would not run out of new things to say. So you're not going to get all of that in one sutta. Secondly, you look at the structure of the sutta. It starts out with the formula for mindfulness, which I've been reading to you here several times. You remain focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. The same with feelings, mind, mental qualities. And then the sutta asks questions only about what does it mean to remain focused. That's the only part of the formula that it explains. The whole question about what it means to be ardent, how you put aside greed and distress with reference to the world, is not explained. So the Buddha is only covering one tiny point of mindfulness. Basically, he's giving you, these are the frameworks that you use. And then once you've got the frameworks to keep in mind as you're practicing, okay, then the next question is, well, how do you apply ardency to that particular framework? For instance, he gives you different sets of feelings that you might be aware of. And as the Buddha said, there are certain pleasant feelings that are to be developed, certain pleasant feelings that are not to be developed. In other words, if there's a kind of pleasure that doesn't get in the way of being alert and concentrated, doesn't get in the way of skillful qualities, that pleasure is okay. Like the pleasure of jhana, the pleasure of being virtuous, the pleasure of being generous. These pleasures are a good thing. If there's a kind of pleasure that gets in the way of the clarity of your mind, and this could be the pleasure of the senses, sensual objects, okay, that's something you actually have to learn how to overcome. Furthermore, the Buddha says feelings don't just happen on their own. You actually shape feel. There's a potential that comes from your past karma that would give rise either, say, to pleasure or to pain. And there are lots of these potentials that are all around you all the time. All too often we think of past karma or as kind of one bank account. When you look at a person right now, or you look at your experience right now, you see the running balance in your account, which is not the case. The Buddha says that your past karma is more like a field that is full of seeds. And at any moment, you're going to be watering some of those seeds. And depending on your skill in choosing what to water or what not to water, you will either experience pleasure or experience pain. So it's not that these things are happening on their own. You're actually going out there and bringing them into being. And then they're going to have an effect on the mind. So you can't just sit there and watch them come and go. Because one, they're not just coming and going. And two, they have a potential for having a good or a bad effect on the mind, which brings you into that issue of what is skillful and what is unskillful. And particularly when the Buddha is talking about feelings, he talks about what he calls feelings of the flesh or feelings not of the flesh. Now, feelings of the flesh are your ordinary pleasures of the sights, sounds, smells, taste, tactile sensations. Feelings not of the flesh have to do with the practice of right concentration. There's a pleasure of not of the flesh, i.e. when you are able to get the mind into concentration and it feels good. There is a pain not of the flesh, which means your mind is not as concentrated as you want it to be. And you get upset about that. But the Buddha said that's actually to be cultivated. Because otherwise you go back to being upset about the fact that you're not getting other pleasures that you want outside. So he says this particular pain is actually useful because it's motivation on the path. So that's one way in which the sutta is not complete, or it's being misread, that people say this is a total explanation of the practice, but it only explains one part. It explains what does it mean to remain focused, and then you have to fill in the rest. What does it mean to be ardent? How are you at best ardent? What's this most skillful way to be ardent? That has to be found from other parts of the canon. There are other passages in the canon that are often misread as well. For example, this says, you remain focused internally on the body in and of itself, or externally on the body in and of itself, or both internally and externally on the body in and of itself. Or you remain focused on the phenomenon of origination with regard to the body, on the phenomenon of passing away with regard to the body, or the phenomenon of origination and passing away with regard to the body. Or your mindfulness that there is a body is maintained to the extent of knowledge and remembrance, and you remain independent, unsustained, or not clinging to anything in the world. Okay, notice there are several auras in there. Now, many times this is interpreted without any auras. In other words, this is one description of what it means to be mindful. And everyone focuses on that last thing. You just remember there is a body, and then you try not to be attached to anything in the world. What's actually here is the Buddha is talking about 3 levels of practice. First, you learn to look at your body. If looking at your own body is not enough, you look at the bodies of other people. You keep in mind the fact that everybody else has the same kind of body you have. This is to get over that, the idea that wouldn't it be nice if I could be reborn and have a nicer body? I could be a movie star, I could be a supermodel. And the Buddha says, of course he didn't talk about supermodels, but he's basically saying, you don't want to go there. And then you think about the supermodels, okay? They have to go to the bathroom just like you. They get sick just like you. They have other problems you would never dream of. So you begin to realize, okay, that the drawbacks that you have in your body, people with more beautiful bodies or stronger bodies or whatever, more skillful bodies, they have the same problems. So you try to keep those things in mind. That's the first stage. The second stage is what the Buddha talks about, the phenomenon of origination and passing away with regard to the body. Now this, in another place, he calls the development of right mindfulness. And it's to be developed through all elements of the path. It's important to notice the word, the phenomenon of origination. He's not saying just arising. Origination means seeing how things are caused. You're focused on the body, okay, how is it that pleasure can be caused with reference to the body? Or how is it that you can create good mind states or bad mind states, say simply by the way you breathe? You're looking for cause and effect. Now the only way you can know cause and effect is if you experiment. You try changing things. I mean, every scientist knows this. If you're going to learn about rabbits, you don't just sit there and look at rabbits. You do things to them. You poke them. You give them food. You take the food away. You turn up the temperature. You turn down the temperature to see what has an effect on the rabbit's respiration, what has an effect on their health. And it's by manipulating things that you actually see cause and effect. And so this is what the Buddha is actually recommending here. Now, for another example, you want to learn about eggs. Again, you don't just take an egg and look at it. You take the egg and you put it in the kitchen. You try frying it. You try making omelets with it. You try making souffles. You try making various different dishes. And in making those different dishes, you learn all about eggs. Now, concentration is basically an omelet or a souffle of the mind. You're trying your best to put it in a good shape, and then you're going to be learning about cause and effect as you do that. So it's, as I said, it's sometimes this passage is read as if the Buddha is simply telling you just watch things arise and passing away, but it's not. He's saying, look for how things are originated, how things are caused. And for that, you've got to experiment. And that's what right concentration is all about. Then there's finally the third step. Once you've learned about the mind through this experimentation, then you're in a position where you can attain that equipoise. place where you just simply are aware of things. And that's all you've got to do, is just keep in mind your frame of reference in mind, and then just watch whatever's coming and going. Seeing whatever comes and goes has an element of stress, so that you can finally abandon it. This is the level that in another place the Buddha talks about, when he says the ultimate level of right view is just watching whatever arises as stress, whatever passes away as stress, and you're willing to let go of it. Now, you're not going to get to that point at the beginning. That's the third stage of the practice, and it takes quite a while, a lot of experience with concentration to get there. So these are some of the reasons why the Satipatthana Sutta has been misread, and why people get the idea that it's all about just arising and passing away. They haven't read the sutta carefully enough, and they haven't put it in the context of the rest of the canon. In another place, of course, you hear that people will say that the mindfulness practice of just accepting things works for them. Now, the Buddha admits that simply watching things coming and going will work with some defilements. But he doesn't call that mindfulness, he calls that equanimity. You're learning how to be accepting and equanimous about whatever comes and goes. And that's a quality of mind that is sometimes skillful and sometimes not. And it sometimes will work and sometimes won't work. In particular, he says there are two kinds of defilements in the mind. The first kind is that you simply look at it and it goes away. It's almost like it gets embarrassed. You know, certain kinds of greed will arise in your mind, and you look at it and you say, I can't go to that. That's ridiculous. And it goes away. Other kinds come, and no matter how much you look at it, they're going to stay. They're very insistent. And that, the Buddha says, you have to make an effort. You have to learn how to think in a new way. You have to learn how to perceive this in a new way. Figure out what's going on. Analyze the problem so that you can finally get down to the core of why would your mind go for that. You might think, okay, right after the talk tonight, you're going to be hungry, you're going to go back and eat a pizza, okay? And you say, I'd like a Hawaiian pizza with lots of pineapple. Now, I personally think Hawaiian pizza is one of the most disgusting things that's been invented. And you might look at it and say, why on earth would I want pineapple together with my tomato sauce? And you finally decide, I can't go there. And sometimes you just look at it and it's ridiculous. Other times you have to think about it. This desire that you have for Hawaiian pizza, it's not really good for you. And you have to tell yourself, okay, why it's not good for you. Then you understand, okay, why it's not going to be good for you. So in the same way, there are some defilements you have that all you have to do is look at it, no problem. And this is what equanimity practice, or this basic acceptance practice is about. It deals with those kinds of problems, but it doesn't touch the other ones. For the other ones, you need to get the mind a lot more concentrated so that it can dig down deeper and find out what the problem is. And furthermore, there's a passage where the Buddha warns that even if you learn how to be equanimous about everything, you get attached to the equanimity unless you see that it too is a fabricated process. Now, if you're taught mindfulness, and many times when you hear mindfulness instructions, they'll say, a moment of mindfulness is a moment of awakening, a moment of mindfulness is a moment of the deathless. That's a trap. Because if you think that that's deathless, then you are not going to dig deeper into how you can get past it. You have to see that this too is something fabricated and that you have to get beyond it. This is what concentration practice is for, is so you get the mind more and more still so you can see levels of fabrication that you wouldn't see otherwise. So on the one hand, concentration allows your awareness to get more precise. It allows your mindfulness to get applied to more and more refined areas of the mind. In the same way, mindfulness itself provides guidance for the concentration. How the best way to concentrate might be. And we look at this, we can look at the Buddha's description for right concentration. The description is fairly long, so I'll ask for you to bear with me. It's divided into what are called 4 jhanas. What is right concentration? 1. There's the case where, quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities, you enter and remain in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. Okay, in the first stage, you're getting away from unskillful thoughts. You're getting away from sensuality. And sensuality here doesn't mean sensual objects. It means the kinds of thinking that will, your desire to think about sensual issues. I'll give you an example. Again, suppose you're going to go out for a pizza tonight, You decide, I want to have a Pizza Hut pizza. You go down, Pizza Hut is closed. That's not too bad, because there are lots of other Pizza Huts. And you can start thinking about, well, maybe Little Caesars isn't so bad. And you go try Little Caesars, and you keep going like this. You can start fantasizing about whether you want pepperoni or, and you can think about pizza for hours, right? How long does it take to eat a pizza? Not all that long. And then you can think about the pizza afterwards. This is what restaurant reviews are for. Okay, all of that thinking, and your obsession with that kind of thinking, that's sensuality. The actual tasting is not the issue. It's the obsession with thinking about these things. Now, if you were told, you can't have this pizza, but you can have another pizza, you wouldn't mind. If you were told, you cannot think thoughts about pizza, the mind would rebel. That's because it's really attached to sensual thinking. And when you're in the first jhana, you've put that aside. You say, I don't need to think about pizza at all. I just want to be here with the breath. I want to be with a sense of the pleasure that can come, not through the senses from outside, but the sense that comes from the internal sense of the body, which the Buddha calls form. And so when you're thinking about, say, the breath, and you're evaluating the breath to make it better, that's when you're beginning to get into the first jhana. In the second jhana, with the stilling of directed thoughts and evaluation, you enter and remain in the second jhana. Rapture and pleasure born of concentration, unification of awareness free from directed thought and evaluation, internal assurance. Okay, in the first jhana, you have a sense of rapture, which means refreshment, and pleasure that just stays at your ability to think about the breath and adjust it. Finally, with the second jhana, you realize, I don't have to adjust it anymore. I can just kind of be one with the breath. Your sense of awareness and the breath come together. You set aside the thinking, the sense of rapture and pleasure gets stronger. And you're just totally fixed in the breath. Now, the only thing that disturbs the concentration at that point is that there is still a sense of rapture and pleasure that continues. And after a while, that rapture begins to get a little unpleasant. It's too energetic. You want something calmer. So for the third jhana, with the fading of rapture, you remain equanimous and mindful and alert. Here it is, mindful, alert, part of the definition. And you sense pleasure with the body. You enter and remain in the third jhana, which the noble ones declare equanimous and mindful, you have a pleasant abiding. So you put aside the rapture, you basically are tuning in to a more refined level of pleasure in the breath. Set aside the rapture and the mind gets more and more solidly there. And finally, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, was with the earlier disappearance of elation and distress, you enter and remain in the fourth jhana, purity of equanimity and mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain. This is the point where the breath actually stops. But focusing on the breath to get in as your topic. The breath energy is so full in the body, there's no felt need to breathe. All the energy channels are connected. And so you're just there, very, very still. But there's a sense of well-being. It's not like you're stifled or you're holding the breath. It's just there's no desire to breathe. And the mind is perfectly equanimous. Everything is still in the body. Now those are the Buddhist descriptions for the jhanas. But he also gives analogies. The analogies are very interesting. Okay. For the first jhana, once you get focused on the breath and you're evaluating it and thinking about it and getting a sense of pleasure and rapture from the breath. And it says, you permeate and pervade, suffuse and fill this very body with a rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Just as if a skilled bathman or bathman's apprentice would pour bath powder into a basin. Back in those days, they didn't have soap. They would take a bath powder, which is kind of like a flour, and mix water with it and make a kind of dough that you would use to bathe yourself with. And pour bath powder into brass basin and knead it together, sprinkling it again and again with water, so that his ball of bath powder, saturated, moisture-laden, permeated within and without, would nevertheless not drip. Even so, you pervade this very body with a rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Now the image here is of working the water through the dough. So whatever sense of pleasure you get from the breath, you kind of work that through the body, so the whole body feels the sense of pleasure, the whole body feels that sense of rapture. That's the first jhana. Notice in this analogy, there is an agent who's doing something. The agent's going to disappear in the other ones. The analogy for the second jhana. You permeate and pervade, suffuse and fill this very body with a rapture and pleasure born of concentration. just like a lake with spring water welling up from within, having no inflow from the east, west, north, or south. And when the skies supplying abundant showers time and again, so that the cool fount of water welling up from within the lake would permeate and pervade, suffuse and fill it with cool waters, there being no part of the lake unpervaded by the cool waters. Okay, here you have motion, but there is no agent doing the motion. There's a sense of things being allowed to fill the body, but you don't have to do it. There's a sense of rapture that just keeps coming up, coming up, coming up. And it spreads throughout the body. In the third analogy, the movement stops. The movement here stands for rapture. Okay. The analogy for the third jhana is, just as with the lotus pond, some of the lotuses born and growing in the water stay immersed in the water and flourish without standing up out of the water, so that they are permeated and pervaded, suffused and filled with cool water from their roots to their tips. And nothing of those lotuses would be unpervaded with cool water. Even so, you permeate and pervade this very body with the pleasure divested of rapture. And there's nothing of the entire body unpervaded with the pleasure divested of rapture. So here the movement's gone. It's just the stillness of the water pervading those lotuses. Everything is very cool and refreshed, from the roots up to the tips. And then finally, the analogy for the fourth jhana. You sit permeating the body with a pure, bright awareness, just as if a man were sitting covered from head to foot with a white cloth, so there would be no part of his body to which the white cloth did not extend. Even so, you sit permeating the body with a pure, bright awareness. There's nothing of your entire body unpervaded by pure, bright awareness. This is right concentration. Okay, this is the fourth jhana. The water disappears now, and it's just this sense of bright awareness filling the body. The pleasure has become equanimity, the rapture, the movement of rapture is gone, and there's just a sense of brightness, clarity in the body. Now that's right concentration. Now notice, as the Buddha describes right concentration, he keeps saying you are mindful throughout. Now what are you mindful of? If you go back to the descriptions of right mindfulness, one of the things that Buddha talks about is the fact that when you notice a mind state arising, you have to realize, okay, this is part of a causal chain. When this thing arises, there's something that's causing it to arise. When it passes away, there's something that causes it to pass away. Not only that, it's going to have an impact on the mind. If it has an unskillful impact, you want to abandon it. If it has a skillful one, you want to develop it. And so in this case, you try to keep that in mind even as you go through these states of concentration. Because it's very easy when you hit a very deep state of concentration, is to think you've hit the ground of being, or some large cosmic metaphysical principle. And the Buddha is saying, no, you have to see that this is something, it results from something you've done. And you have to decide, is this skillful or is it not? Is this as pleasant, or is this totally free of stress, or is there still some stress in here? And that's exactly what mindfulness does, because once you get into the concentration, first it helps you to get in, because you figure out, okay, this is something that's not just hit or miss. You're not shooting birds in the dark, even though when you're first starting to do concentration, that's what it seems like. It comes and then it goes. You have no idea why, when it goes, when it's doing well, when it's not doing well. You have no idea why. But with time, you learn how to see this. And the Buddha gives an example of a cook who learns how to read the wishes of his master. The master doesn't tell the cook, hey, I want sweet food or I want sour food. The cook has to notice, okay, today what kind of food does the master reach for? Then you provide more of that because you can see that's what the master wants. In the same way, you have to learn how to look at your mind to see what does the mind like. Does it like staying with long breathing? Does it like staying with short breathing? Does it like staying with heavy rapture, or does it decide it doesn't like rapture now? It's too heavy. There are lots of things that you want to notice about the mind, and then you learn how to adjust your meditation. This is something you keep in mind, so you can get the mind into concentration. Once you get the mind into concentration, then you learn how to maintain that, which is a different skill. One of the big problems that comes up when you're meditating is, okay, now I've done concentration, what's next? You're ready to move on. You say, no, you've got to learn how to maintain this. This is an important skill, because if you can't maintain it, you don't have a baseline against which to check when the mind is creating more stress and when it's creating less stress. You want a really subtle, still state of mind, so you can see these things coming and going. Once you learn how to keep the mind and concentration, then you can analyze it as as a kind of action, as a kind of karma. What are the causes, what are the effects, and what are the activities that are going into maintaining this? So you want to learn how to see that concentration is still something that's fabricated. And wherever there's fabrication, as the Buddha said, there's going to be stress. Now, what is concentration fabricated out of? It's fabricated out of the 5 aggregates. Now, I'm assuming all of you have read some Buddhist theory. Did anyone not ever hear of the 5 aggregates? Okay, we all know there's form, feeling, perception, fabrication, consciousness. Now, each of these are activities. You'd say, how is form an activity? Of course, the body moves, but the body's always changing. That's the activity of the body. Feeling is an activity of feeling. Perception is the activity of perceiving. Fabrication is the activity of putting things together in the mind. And finally, consciousness is the activity of being aware of these things. Now you may wonder, why did the Buddha talk about these 5 activities? There are lots of other things the mind does as well. I think one of the reasons is that these are the 5 activities that define us as beings. Because how do we define ourselves as beings? We define ourselves by what we like to eat. Physical food, mental food, emotional food. These are the things that we define ourselves through. And these 5 activities go into that. Say, for example, with physical food, you've got the form of the body. You also got the form of the food. Secondly, you've got the feelings. In the body, you've got the feeling of hunger, that you want to get rid of that hunger, and then you have the feeling of satisfaction when the hunger is gone. With perception, you learn 2 things. One, you learn how to perceive what kind of hunger do you have. Is this really a hunger for Hawaiian pizza, or is it a hunger for some Coke? Or is it a hunger for something more substantial? And then, as far as the food out there, one of the first things you learn as a child is to perceive what's food, what's not food. Anyone who's had a child will know the child will go around the room and will just put anything into its mouth. And it's a lot of the lessons of learning up is what you don't put in your mouth. And so that's what perception is about, is to label, okay, this is food, this is not food. Fabrication is the activity that goes into preparing your food. Getting the food. What am I going to do in order to get that food? Once I've got the food, say you've got a raw potato. What do you do with a raw potato? How do you fix it? All of this is fabrication. And then finally, consciousness is the activity of being aware of this. These are all the really most basic activities in the mind. And we tend to feed on these things. And what the Buddha does when he's teaching you how to get into concentration is take these activities and create a concentrated mind. You've got the form of the body, i.e. the breath. You've got feelings of pleasure or pain, and you use the breath to give rise to the feelings of pleasure. Perception is the mental image you hold in mind while you're trying to stay concentrated. Fabrication is your discussion with yourself. Is the mind fitting with the object? If not, what do I do to get the fit more snug? Does the breath feel good? Okay. If it doesn't feel good, we work with that. If I'm carrying in some preconceived problems or moods from the day, how do I get rid of those moods so I can focus on the breath? That's fabrication. And then finally, consciousness is what's aware of all this. So what you're doing when you're concentrating the mind is you're taking these 5 activities and you're turning them into a skillful form of food for the mind. That's one of the functions of right concentration. It's the nourishment that keeps us going on the path. Without this, the path gets very dry. But there comes a point where when you've perfected that, and you realize, okay, this still is fabricated. There's got to be something better than this. The Buddha's talking about, a well-being that is not fabricated. How do we find that? And so he has you take apart that concentration. Here's an example. Take the first example. Suppose that an archer's apprentice, were to practice on a straw man or a mound of clay, so that after a while he'd become able to shoot long distances, to fire accurate shots in rapid succession, and to pierce great masses. In other words, he's talking about this as a skill that you develop over time. In the same way, there's a case where you enter and remain in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure, born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. You regard whatever phenomena there that are connected with form, feeling, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness, i.e. the 5 aggregates. You regard them as inconstant, stressful, a disease, a cancer, an arrow, painful, an affliction, alien, a disintegration, an emptiness, or not self. Okay, in other words, you learn to look at the state of concentration itself as something that you want to develop dispassion for, either seeing that it's, because it's fabricated, it's not the ultimate happiness. You want something better. So you turn your mind away from those phenomena, and having done so, you incline it to the property of deathlessness. This is peace, this is exquisite, the resolution of all fabrications, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the ending of craving, dispassion, cessation, unbinding. Staying right there, you reach the end of the defilements. Or if not, then through this very Dharma passion, this Dharma delight, and through the total ending of the 5 lower fetters, which is self-identity views, grasping at habits and practices, uncertainty, sensual passion, and irritation, you're due to arise spontaneously in the pure abodes, i.e. become a non-returner. There to be totally unbound, never again to return from that world. Okay, this is how you end your defilements, based on the first jhana. Now notice the stages in this. One is you master the concentration, so you can develop some detachment from sensuality. Now this concentration, of course, is based on a perception that you have to keep in mind. Mindfulness does that for you. Then you learn how to see the aggregates from which that concentration is created in light of other perceptions that develop dispassion. You can perceive it either as not self, you can perceive it as inconstant. For example, you see the pleasure goes up and it goes down. You say, wait a minute, you can't really rely on it if it's something going up and going down. Okay, well then the question is, well, what did I do to just make the stress go up? What did I do to make the stress go down? You look deeper into what's creating this. You begin to see that this is inconstant. Or you can see that there's still stress in this because you have to put activity into it to maintain it. Or you see that it's not really worthy of identifying with anymore. Because it can use perceptions to develop that dispassion. So then you incline your mind to a better happiness, which is the deathless. And then you try to stay there without developing any passion, even for the sensation of the deathless when it hits. Because if you develop a passion for it, okay, there's going to be clinging, and you're going to hold on to it. This is why when the Buddha says all dhammas are not self, because you have to cut through that last clinging. But so even here in this stage of concentration, you've got to use mindfulness. 1, mindfulness gets you into the concentration. 2, you have to remember, how do I get over my dispassion for this? 3, you have to remind yourself, don't get excited about what good things come up when you do that. So mindfulness and concentration have to go together. The concentration is what allows you to see these things in action. The mindfulness is what reminds you, okay, once I see these things, what do I do? Otherwise you forget everything the Buddha taught you and you just latch on. And you never get free. So it's in this way, when the Buddha is talking about mindfulness and concentration, he's not talking about 2 different states of mind. He's talking about 2 processes that have to go together if you're going to attain the goal that he set out, which is the ultimate health of unbinding. So I think it's important that we try to get our understanding of these 2 qualities together, because otherwise the NIH is going to come and say, hey, look, Buddhism doesn't know what it's talking about. We've tried to be equanimous, mindful, and still people are doing stupid things. There's a satirical piece that appeared on the web a while back. I was saying mindfulness conquers the world. People who used to do things unmindfully are still doing the same things, but now they're doing mindfully. It doesn't make any difference. The whole point of the path is that it makes a difference, that it really does get you to see where you're creating stress for yourself and for other people, where it's not necessary, and how you can put an end to that. Now to do that, you have to be mindful and you have to develop your concentration. Concentration not only gives the stillness that you need to see these things, but also gives you that sense of nourishment, this inner sense of well-being that makes it you're happy to let go of your other attachments. And the mindfulness is what reminds you, okay, this is the skillful thing to do with that power. The power of the concentration, the skillful thing to do with this, the nourishment of the concentration. To go beyond what's fabricated to something that's totally in another dimension. So those are some thoughts about concentration and mindfulness.